In this lesson, we are going to continue to look at saving data to the options table in WordPress. However, now we're going to look at saving more complex forms of data in the form of arrays. So what we have in this plugin is a very similar setup. We have our menu with our template being pulled out for our settings page, and then in options, we have a few extra things than we did before. So let's take a look at that now. First of all, you can see we're hooking into admin and init again, so there's nothing really new there. And we're setting up an array of options. So in the last example, we simply had a string and we were only saving one piece of information. Now in this case, we're going to save multiple pieces of information. And if WP plugin option doesn't exist, we're going to go ahead and run that. And let's just go ahead and run update just in case, because in the last example, we probably already had data saved from that. And we'll talk at the very end of this section about what to do with uninstalling plugins and removing data and all that. But for now, let's just go ahead and run update just in case it already exists. And we want to save this string of information. Now, rather than going into the database to look at this, we could actually just display it on the front end of our page. So let's come into our settings page markup, and you can see we're getting the title, we're saying all options, we're getting our option, WP plugin option, and then we're going to loop through it with a for each loop. So for each loop, we're just going to put out the specific option, and we should get them in order. We're going to save looking at this next block of code for a little bit later, so let's just go ahead and run it like this. So coming down in my plugin, I'm going to activate option arrays and then come into my plugins page, and we can see we've got first name, second option, third option. That's perfect, because if we come back to our options file, that's exactly what we set up. Now let's go ahead and change this a bit, and the reason we want to change this up is that we have different pieces of information, but we don't know what that information is. So what often makes more sense is to set up our options array something like this, where we're using a named array instead, so that's easily for us to figure out what data we're actually working with. And hopefully that makes sense. If you haven't worked with PHP a little bit more, then this might be new to you, but really what this is going to allow is the same thing as the first one, except we could attach a name to each one of these using this approach. So in this case, add option won't run because we already have the option set up, but in the case here of update option, it's going to update it with this new information here. So that's great. And then if we come back into our settings page, this will run and we should see the same thing as before. What this block of code does is check to see if a certain name option exists. So here we have the name, location, and sponsor. So this block of code is something that you could use, particularly this conditional statement right here, to simply change this to location, sponsor, name, and this way you could have a whole bunch of data. You know, you don't want to get too much, but you could have a decent amount of text stored, especially if you had a few short things that your plugin needed to know about, references, IDs, little strings of text, or other information like that. You could check for just that specific one, and then you would not have access to it directly, but you could call it in this way by saying, give me that array, which I already have access to, and just the name specifically. So underneath this other header here, we should expect to see just the name that we have saved in our string here. So let's go ahead and look at that in our plugin. So if we plug into our plugin now and we refresh the page, we could see all of the options just as we had expected, and then we could also get the name. So you might be wondering, how do I get the key or the value? And that's just getting a little bit more into PHP, and a quick Google search will quickly explain that to you. But this is how you get the data, and you should easily be able to work with it from here. Now, the last thing that I'll mention about this approach is that you might think for your plugin, okay, I'm going to have my plugin option 1, and then I'll have my plugin option 2, and then I'll have 3 and 4 and 5. And this can get unwieldy when you start to have a bunch of different pieces of information and you're not sure what their name is or how a number correlates to a name. So it's better to really just have 1 or 2, maybe 3. Maybe you have a couple different options, but those options are storing complex information. So you're not just storing each one of your settings as its own entry point. Now, if you understand a little bit about database architecture, you're welcome to explore that in different ways, but most of the time, especially with the simple plugin, what you're probably going to be able to get away with is a named array like this in PHP, and then saving that to the options table. Now, because we've been saving it and not looking at the database, we don't actually see what's going on behind the scenes here. So the last little bit of this, I need to point out what happens when you try to save an array like this into a database in WordPress. So I'm going to come into my database browser here, come into WP Options, and then I should just be able to click to the very end because we've been saving this recently. So here's my plugin option. Now notice what this says here, and I'll pull this out into a text so that we can see it better. This says A3 S, or well, this bracket S4 name colon S10 S8 location. And what this means is we have an array of 3 items. And this is what is referred to as a serialized array. That is an array that initially looked like this in PHP and had certain constructs because of the PHP language, but we're not saving in PHP, we're saving in MySQL. And in that way, we can't really save that complex data. So what we do instead is we save a string of text, which MySQL can save. However, it's structured text, in this case what is referred to as a serialized array. So when we save this data into the WordPress database, when we say update option or add option with an array, it automatically converts it into the serialized form. Likewise, when we do get options or get option, it will deserialize or unserialize this data back into a normal array. So we see an array with 3 items. This is a string with 4 characters, which is name, then a string with 10, which is this value. And then it knows that these 2 together would be 1 item, and then the next one is a string with location, and then the string here, and it would know to deconstruct that into a named array. So it is quite complex what's going on behind the scenes there, but luckily we don't have to deal with any of that because the WordPress functions are doing all of that for us. However, for your own reference, it is important to know that the database does store information in this way. And if you ever come across the term a serialized array, that is what all of these are. Notice some of these are actually objects. We have an array with 25 items, an array with 112, an object with 8 things in it. Some of these are just strings of text. So you can see that a lot of different data is stored in this way in the WordPress database. It's not just going to be our values. We're following some pretty standard conventions here. So go ahead and practice playing around with saving serialized arrays or just arrays as data and then pulling out specific ones. And then in the next lesson, we will get some practice doing this a little bit more.